All good here in Germany, except we're heading to another lockdown. But that's exactly the issue that I wanted to talk to you, start off with. So, last year when we talked in May 2020, the coronavirus was still fresh. It was hardly to accurately assess the situation. Back then, I specifically asked you about civil liberties, and you stated, and I'm paraphrasing here, that although the government can be justified in some of its measures to ensure the protection of health and safety for its citizens, it is vital for citizens to remain vigilant during these times as these laws could become permanent. By the way, just as a side note, the video that I'm referring to was immediately taken down by YouTube. Anyways, getting back to the issue, now almost 19 months later, we're seeing a completely different landscape. In many countries, digital vaccine IDs have been implemented that involve the corporate sector. We are seeing measures such as COVID passports and vaccine mandates being instituted. In Germany, for example, restrictions to many public jobs or services are being expanded to only vaccinated or those who have recovered from COVID 19. Chomsky even stated that unvaccinated people should voluntarily isolate themselves and food supplies is their own problem. In essence, for good or bad reason, we have a divided society. What is your assessment of the situation now? Is the government justified or do you think it has gone too far?
I think I would say that with any kind of questions involving a conflict between public safety on the one hand and civil liberties or government power on the other, a good framework to use is what happened after 9/11, in part because it was such a vivid example from which we've all learned so many lessons. Maybe it's also because it was the event that propelled me to leave the practice of law and start writing about politics. And so it's the starting point I use. But what happened there, I think, is very instructive, which is there really was an actual threat that was invoked to justify what was done after 9/11. The threat of terrorism was real. There were two passenger jets flown into two enormous office buildings in downtown Manhattan. It killed 3,000 people. Another was flown into the Pentagon. There was a fourth that was shot down. There have been terrorist attacks over the years that have involved mass casualties in the United States and outside. So it wasn't that the threat was fake. It wasn't that it was not something we should be concerned about. The question was, are we allowing the government to go too far in exaggerating the threat and claiming powers for too long a period of time that exceed the actual threat? And I think most of us concluded the answer was yes. And so many of the things that happened right after 9/11 that we were told were going to be temporary just until the crisis was controlled, things like the Patriot Act, but many other examples as well, are still with us 20 years later, even though there's basically no more Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden is dead, ISIS is defeated. So I think the lesson is that once you empower governments and states and officials and other power centers to obtain authorities in the name of fighting a particular threat or crisis, they don't go away. And here we are at the end of 2021 now. The interview we did was 18 months ago. And not only are all of those powers I was worried about back then still with us, we're talking about even greater powers still, more lockdowns, talking about people who refuse to comply with health protocols, being separated from society, denied jobs, and denied the right to travel. And what's amazing about that is when we did our interview and I was worried back in June or whatever it was of 2020, there was no vaccine, there were no treatments, we understood very little about the virus. Here we are 18 months later, where by far the most important thing that has changed is that there's a vaccine that's universally available that really does protect you against serious sickness and death in almost all cases. And yet there's almost like no recognition that that is a very significant change. And I think that shows you that a lot of times this inertia just continues on its own. As for the question of how we treat the unvaccinated and the Chomsky idea that they ought to be basically put in camps, that's more or less what he said. They ought to be isolated and shunned and just prevented from doing anything other than leaving this physical space. And then kind of at the end, he said, I guess we should bring them food the way we bring prisoners food. But other than that, they should be denied every right and every privilege. I think it makes no sense from any kind of perspective of morality or ethics or science for two reasons. One is that if you believe in the efficacy of the vaccines, as I do, I believe that my being vaccinated protects me from serious illness, let alone death. There's no reason why I should view the unvaccinated as a danger or as a threat. To whom are the unvaccinated a danger? If you believe in the vaccine, they're not a danger to vaccinated people. So why do you need to fire them and punish them and put them in camps? Secondly, if you're worried about people transmitting the virus to you, we know that people who are vaccinated often do contract COVID anyway and transmit COVID. There's more and more breakthrough cases. I think in several states in the United States, 25% of all COVID deaths are vaccinated people. It stands to reason that even a higher percentage of the cases are vaccinated people. So given that vaccinated people can get and transmit the virus to us along with the unvaccinated, what is the reason we ought to continue to look at the unvaccinated as these threats, as these people who need to be punished and deprived basic rights? I think it's really become this kind of like almost punitive approach, like this almost religious fervor that people who are vaccinated are clean and blessed and good, and the people who disobey and don't get the vaccine are sinful, are dirty, are disease carriers. Really dangerous kind of rhetoric. If we look at how that rhetoric has been used in history, and it's increasingly concerning me.